So Ayesha Ramachandran is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature. Professor Ramachandran is a literary critic and cultural historian of early modern Europe. Her recent work focuses on Europe's relations with an expanding world, and her first book on that topic, The World Makers, was awarded the MLA's Scaglione Prize in Comparative Literary Studies, the Milton Society of America's Shawcross Prize for the Best Book Chapter on Milton, and the 16th Century Studies Association's Founders Prize for the Best First Book Manuscript. In addition to literary and intellectual historical questions, she is interested in early modern maps, particularly world mapping, the history of science and technology, early modern empires, and the rich visual archive of illustrated books in the period. Her current book project, Lyric Thinking, Humanism, Selfhood, Modernity, argues for the central importance of lyric form and language in shaping new intellectual possibilities for the self in the early modern period and beyond. Christophe Schuwey is Assistant Professor of French. Christophe, I'm going to apologize in advance. I took French for reading, and so I can't speak French, so I'm going to blunder a few of these things. But Professor Schuwey specializes in the literature and culture of 17th century France. His research focuses on the book market, fashion and marketing in the classical age, the circulation of news, the making of cultural hierarchies and cultural transfers, especially between England and France. He is the author of, and here I'll read the translation only, Painting the Times Through Comedy, an Introduction to Moliere's Misanthrope and Tartuffe, and co-author of 3 critical editions, the Nouvelle by Donnet de Vise, Les Parnasses Réformées by Gabriel Guéret, and a forthcoming edition of the Alcoran of Louis XIV. Professor Schuwey is thus also active in the field of digital humanities, which we'll hear more about today, with the mentioned critical editions, multiple databases, including The Birth of Dramatic Criticism in 17th Century France, again, I'm reading the translation, and book interfaces What Digital Humanities Can Do for Literature. Please welcome Professors Ramachandran and Schuwey.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Take it away.
Yeah. Can we put away our mask? I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, hello everyone. We're very glad to be here, Ayesha and I, to talk a bit about what is available to you in terms of resources and help about this thing that is terrifying thing that is called digital humanities. There has been a lot of debates around institution on what is digital humanities. As always with any fields, there are questions of power, there are questions of resources that are at play here. So there are multiple definitions of digital humanities. And one definition that could be representative of what we're doing at Yale is maybe the simplest one, the uses of computers to study, contribute to, and discuss the humanities. So what do we mean by that? Maybe the best way to address that is to talk a bit about our own stories and our relationship to digital humanities. So I came to digital humanities because during my PhD, I started using old 17th century French books that were not available in my hometown, which is Switzerland, and Fribourg, but that was only available in Paris. So it was easier for me to use Google Books to access them than to go to Paris every week to check out these books, right? So I started to use digital versions of books, and then I started to use plain text search in Google Books to find things that I were interested in. And then I use library catalogs, digital library catalogs, to start to find trends. Is it this word a buzzword between 1660 and 1670, for instance? And all this kind of very everyday application of computers to the study of humanities. Right. So when I arrived in Paris, I suddenly realized that there was a whole field called digital humanities, where we were making graphs, where we were making trees, where we were making maps, etc. And I both discovered how useful this kind of representation and new approaches to the humanities were, but also how they can sometimes take all the resources and drive us away from the actual work with humanities and with the actual question of questions we're interested in the humanities. So this is why I wrote this book called Interfaces, which is a book that says, actually, it is as much digital humanities to use a library catalog than to make a big data project that will analyze topic modeling across 2 centuries of text, right? All of this is using the computers to change our relationship and work and questions to the digital humanities. Because as useful big data is, the transformation that digital humanities is creating for the humanities is a kind of everyday thing. The fact that we're accessing resources, that we are writing, not using a pencil, but a computer, is changing the way we're working, is changing the way we're thinking, is changing the questions we are trying to address. And this is the approach, the kind of minimal, but as inclusive as it can be, approaches that we try to rely on here at Yale.
That's actually funny. I didn't know Christophe's origin story, so now I do. And actually, it's very funny because I have a similar origin story. I was writing my dissertation trying to track the appearance of the word world across a body of text over 2 centuries, and did the same thing. I was like, well, this was, of course, in the early 2000s, before the kind of huge blowing up of big data searches and large kinds of, it was the early days of the Google Ngram. And I began to think, wow, what are the databases of text, and how do we begin to sort and understand empirically if we can track these sort of thematics and concepts lexically across multiple texts. And I did some of that work for my dissertation and then quickly became disillusioned with the kind of grand possibilities. It was kind of the early days of DH still, and kind of moved away from the digital humanities, in part because I asked a question I think many humanists ask, which is, do I really need to go to computers and count things in order to answer interpretive questions that are actually at the heart of the humanities? And so in what ways is digital humanities, or the promise of databases, big data, text mining, spatial analysis, etc., really just a kind of grand dream of making the humanities more like the sciences, as opposed to actually asking deeper methodological questions about what these tools can give, kind of traditional questions in the humanities, and support kind of traditional training in the humanities, which most graduate students actually still get today, and which is what I teach in my own classes. I found my way coming back, interestingly, to the digital humanities after a long phase of what I would call a kind of skeptical crisis, which is, having used these methods myself, I sort of thought, well, this is really not helpful. This has just become a thing. I'm not interested in a kind of scientism, in part because my own work is in the history of science. And then I found myself in my new project, which is about lyric poetry and thinking about global lyric poetry on a kind of scale that is impossible to look at bibliographically by an individual person, to think, well, okay, so do computers actually have something to tell us or help us in synthesizing, putting together, and thinking differently about the objects of our study? And one of the things that's important here, I think, about this definition, which is in some ways deeply simple but also incredibly complicated, is computers just think in 2 ways: yes or no, 0 or 1. This is not how humanists think. So if you want to ask the computer to do something for you, any kind of analytical work, you have to recraft the sort of question as a humanist you were asking a computer to do. And this is true for supercomputing. This is true for like the very basic question of, is this yes or no, on or off? There's a kind of powerful binary in the way in which computers work. And so to reimagine bibliographical questions, what is a poem? Does this count? Is this kind of poem or that kind of poem? Requires you to ask really profoundly precise questions about the object of your study, which often as humanists we're not trained to ask. So I found my way back to this project I'm working on right now, which is a census of lyric poetry for the early modern period on a global scale, which is deeply collaborative, deeply humanistic, but has also forced me in the process of just articulating what is my data model to ask questions about poetics that usually people who write about poetry don't ask. And that has produced a lot of interesting intellectual work almost alongside and separate from the business of actually trying to figure out how would I build a data model to talk about poems, and how do we analyze large-scale volumes of text to find poems that we may not otherwise have cataloged, right? So my origin story in some ways is a story of both fascination, skepticism, and then a kind of almost reluctant return, but a reminder that digital humanities is not just about learning a bunch of tools, which we're going to tell you about in a moment, but also about an encounter with a different paradigm of thinking, and a paradigm of thinking that can exist alongside and in conversation with the ways in which humanists are traditionally trained, right? And I think Yale is in some ways a great place to do that kind of conceptual work, because we're not an institution that's invested in the fantasy of the tool. We are an institution that is deeply embedded in thinking philologically, thinking in comparatively, thinking in all of the kind of traditional ways in which interpretively in which humanists are trained. trained. So how do we take that traditional training and think about this new or so-called new method, and what can it do for us? And I think that this is a place with a lot of resources for that. So we thought we would turn briefly to just talk about some examples of the kinds of digital humanities work that people are doing in our fields in the humanities and which are similar to Yale. So we'll just go back and forth between us. Let's start by looking, and Christophe has kindly put a map here. This is for my pleasure. Thank you. A lot of my work on mapping, the history of mapping in the 16th century, began actually with looking at maps online before I actually went to the libraries that held these books. And there's a lot one can say about the relationship between the digital collection and the actual object, and that's a whole field of study itself. But Yale, because of its extraordinary collections, is a place in which the interface of digital and an actual object is being thought about deeply across a number of different collections, and that is one place in which digital humanities is powerful, alive, and kind of being made every day in our teaching and research here.
Yeah, and I would like to add about that as much as we can think about the relationship between the original object and a digital version of an object, the alternative before digital humanities were the critical edition in its white standardized paper. So accessing those texts, those maps, those material, even through a photograph that is not a perfect replica of the original object, is already bringing in back a materiality that was almost lost for many, many, many decades before. And this is, I think, something that we humanists are perfectly trained to think about and to explore further than just saying it's bad or it's the revolution of the world. It's more complicated than that, right? Another kind of project that is digital humanities is digital edition. And I think the screen here can be used not only to replicate, again, the original object, but to try of new visual and experiences and new relationship to our object. Trying, for instance, to rethink the very concept of the footnote, which is still very widely used in digital editions today. A footnote, and in French, it's a note de bas de page, so it's related to the page. It doesn't make any sense anymore. So how can we think reference in a different way, in a digital world? How can we bring some sort of different reading experience than the linear one from the start of the book to the end of the book, knowing that often with many books we're actually not reading them differently. This is also something that digital editions can do on the top of making texts more accessible, more easily accessible, that can be read for if we need to hear this text instead of reading it, etc., etc.
Should we go to the next one?
Yep.
All right. Do you want to do this one?
I can start and then...
Yeah, let's do it.
So all this is not to say that this other most visible part of the digital humanities that are graphs, maps, trees, to quote Franco Moretti's book, is not important, right? But I think it should be taken into a more general, broad approach that it's another way of looking at things. The same way a digital edition or a photograph of material is another way of looking at something. Here is another way of looking at our text. And sometimes it doesn't answer any question that is useful. And sometimes it does answer many questions that we need to know and that were very difficult to answer before. And both are true.
Yeah, and I would just add to that here, looking at these charts, that one of the things we don't talk about when we talk about digital humanities is the question of data literacy, right? And what that simply means is what kinds of objects are data for humanists, and what is the relationship between them, and how is that the grounds of a kind of analysis that allows us to be critically self-reflexive about what we are actually doing, right? So having to think about humanities objects in terms of data and to think about what kinds of relationships we're setting up with them, which is the kind of conceptual work of the digital humanities that produces things like this, right? The setting up of a corpus, the setting up of a database, these things seem deeply ordinary in a certain way, but they also require a level of thinking that is not the same thing as like reading a novel, right? It's thinking about what do we do with that novel when we want to create a kind of database of characters or count certain kinds of relationships. Should you go to the next one? All right, so the other thing that's very familiar to humanists and digital humanities is text mining, or sort of the kind of corpus searching that both Christophe and I did as our origin stories of the digital humanities. This is an example from the early print lab, a project at the University of Washington at St. Louis, which is deeply tagged corpus of early modern texts, which can be searched in various ways using Python and other kinds of programs to understand relationships between texts, words in text, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of deep textual searching that a lot of students will use or should think about using in their projects. However, the learning curve to get there and the kinds of things you can do with them is not insubstantial.
Maybe.
All right, this is me again. Okay, so this is actually an example of a project that was piloted here at the Digital Humanities Lab at Yale, and it's kind of an extraordinary project for image analysis. So one of the things that is an affordance, I think, of the digital humanities now is the ability to analyze very large amounts, not just of text, but also of images through the use of neural networks. And Pixplot is a tool that was built here at the Digital Humanities Lab in order to do that work, to sort of analyze relationships between very large numbers of images. And this is something that is actually used widely in the sciences for various reasons. I mean, particularly in like biology, to look at organisms and sort of shifting and chemistry for molecules, and for electron analysis. Its application in the humanities is very different because of the kinds of images and the questions we want to ask of images, right? And so Pixplot is one example of the kind of large-scale image analysis that can be done. And I will say in my own project right now with lyric poetry, I'm exploring the possibility of, we have many, many pictures of manuscript pages. And because of the shape of a poem that is so distinctive, can we use image analysis to identify poems in large-scale manuscript corpora that are digitized into images that are not already OCR'd, and we can't actually search them textually because they're in handwriting, right? So in what ways do text and image merge, right, for us to think differently about the nature of our objects?
And this is a point, for instance, where those kind of connection and resemblance that suddenly the computer shows us, maybe some of them are not relevant.
Yeah.
But this is the ability of the digital humanities to raise question. If we decide that it's not relevant, then good, not a problem. But sometimes also being able to see so much material in such a short time span is also a way to create some relationship that we didn't see, that we missed, that the critic missed until now. Yeah. Should we go to the next one? Yeah. Something also that is transformative is the access to data. That's the very definition of digital humanities. But the fact that we have databases, thematic databases of, for instance, performances in the past or contemporary performances is also a way to access things that were available somewhere, but that would require a tremendous amount of work to get it together. And every time the question changed, then you had to go again to the archive and ask a different question, right? And I don't think that any mathematician would say that computer just made things easier. I think that when you can suddenly ask question that takes a couple of seconds to answer versus months to answer, then you deeply change the way you approach and work with the humanities.
So very quickly, because I see you're running out of time, another thing that digital humanities work does is various kinds of spatial analysis. This is a project in classics. It's a digital atlas of the Roman Empire, which is a lot of people use. The production to think about the relationship of space and sort of humanistic objects, again, produces many different kinds of spatial analysis possibilities, from the use of maps to the creation of maps to the use of GIS to map various kinds of data onto kind of various sorts of spatial locations. That's a kind of work that a number of people in the humanities are increasingly doing, and that again produce the ability to ask and answer different kinds of questions.
So this circles back to something that we touched on, digital humanities, but also humanities as data. Actually, what digital humanities allows us also to think is that what we consider as humanities is also sometimes data that can be represented in a different way. That makes us get away from the only textual narrative paradigm to something different. Sometimes what we think is purely humanistic is actually data and can be better represented in different form of data, maps, etc., than sometimes narrated in a text. So, do you want to add something? No. So, question for you, very more concrete. What do we have? Oh. The E is what resources do we have at Yale? That's the technical issues.
Problems, yes.
So there is a many initiative at Yale for digital humanities, people doing digital humanities at Yale, as you will find out. But there are two, I would say, main resource that you should think about. So the first one is the Yale DH Lab that is in the Sterling Library. The Yale DH Lab offers support for any of your project. You go there during your office hours. Whatever your level is, how precise you are and how unprecise you are, you go there, you talk with them about your project, and they will help. They can offer grants to start your project. They can offer technical support. They can offer a wide array of support, and both technical and advice and development and technology, etc. And please, if you never did anything digital, go there, because this is made exactly for you. If you already know how to do it, then you don't need a DHM at some point. The other one is the more let's say scholarly theoretical initiative. This is the initiative that Ayesha and I are chairing, so the DH at Yale, which is trying to build a community around this question of DH. So a place where anyone can come and discuss, find other people who are interested in digital humanities. We have a reading group. The first meeting will be November 30. If you're interested, please write to any of us to be added to the list, where we try to understand where is the field going, what we can do with digital humanities, find support, find projects that you might be interested to collaborate in. And so please join, whatever your level, whatever your interest, and we would be happy to have you.
Yeah, and I just want to close us out by saying that, Yale Humanities is powerful for its connection to its collections, its long histories of training here that go back centuries. But it's not, the humanities at Yale are not like at Stanford or MIT that have been tied to sort of tied to the development of tools, the sort of technical development in the ways that the kind of digital humanities labs at those institutions have evolved over the last sort of 15 years or so. Instead, I think what we do here, which is very powerful, and this is where the DH at Yale sort of working group is a good place to get started, is to think conceptually about how the interaction or the interface, to use Christophe's words, with computers and the humanities allows us to think differently, ask different questions, and go to the tools we need really to answer the questions that are generated by our own research. So less a kind of, I would say, fetishization of the possibility of the internet revolution, and more about thinking in powerfully new ways about the way in which the binarism of the computer and the complexity of the humanities interact to create new models of thinking, research, scholarship, and teaching. So thanks. So we're happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was curious, I heard your history of science piece in there, and I was curious, how do you track, or how would we be cognizant of when terminology can shift for things? So descriptions of conditions or ailments or things like that, the language around them evolves over time.
So that's actually a great question. And then this is where I think it's also an example of how digital humanities is not about just plugging stuff into a computer, right? So I think one of the things that's really tricky about that kind of scholarship is you have to do a fair amount of preliminary work to be able to know what your search terms are at all, right? And so that also means working collaboratively. And this is something that I think humanists in particular are not very well trained to do in a way that scientists really are, which is to not think of yourself as the generator of knowledge, but to think of a distributed model in which you might have to collaboratively go to a lot of people and be like, you're a 14th century specialist, like how was this thing talked about in those texts? And then generate, your own corpus of search terminology that then you would be able to feed into a number of different databases to track perhaps contextually then how that particular word or phrase shifts. But that does require, this is actually crucial, it does require kind of preliminary work before you can apply a digital technique. And so I think that often the sense of digital humanities is, we're going to go and get something quickly. And I think that actually, Christophe,
Exactly. The magic thinking of digital humanities.
Yeah, and the truth is, it takes a very long time to even do things like figure out, what's my corpus? I'm still spending all this time thinking about, what is a lyric poem in a bunch of different traditions? Even that terminological question, but also the, how do we define the object in a way that the computer can understand, right? And that binary thinking is a huge conceptual challenge, right? That is the big work in some ways. The small work is the actual stuff of plugging it in and, hitting a button. Right.
Hi, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. So I just have I've been, I'm in the administrative department, and I've been to the DHS lab, and the really one of the reasons that I guess I've not been able to use it to the extent that I think I can, or should, despite the fact that I think it might benefit my project, is because of the technical skills required.
Yes.
And that's a lot, I feel, like if you're not Bill Drunken, and if it doesn't come sort of, if you haven't the training for it, it's a very specific set of skills so just moving forward, are there ways in which we can provide students with, because I think it takes a lot of time, at least
Yes.
to develop the sort of, especially for those of us who are not coming from those backgrounds. So I was just wondering of like what your ideas are about as you go.
So, I will just say one thing. I think that what you're putting your finger on is a larger pedagogical and curricular issue in doctoral training. And I will say that one of the aspects of the doctoral report that was published last year by the working group for the graduate school was that departments need to think about other pathways, to build in pathways into doctoral programs precisely to recognize things like if you have to learn Python, learning Python is like learning Latin in a certain way, right? And so can we, for instance, find ways within doctoral training to create time for students to get the skills they might need to do the scholarship that they want to do? And so that is a hugely important and big question in the long term. I think there's a lot of conversation about how to do that in different departments. You should talk to your own advisor in DGS about ways that you can actually use that to meet requirements in your program, because departments are becoming flexible about this. The shorter term answer, I'm going to leave that to Christophe, who has acquired many of these skills.
No, but I so agree, and that's a general discussion even in the humanities beyond Yale, right? We try to, and also the question of recognition. One thing that I think is interesting in what you're saying is there should be a way to do digital humanities with not a lot of technical skills. And this is, I think, where, for instance, something like the Yale DH Lab can help. But what I mean beyond that is that the conceptual work should bring questions that then someone who is specialized can answer. And digital humanities shouldn't be, at least this is what we believe, necessarily techy. It's great, of course, it's fantastic. It allows to think differently, it allows to do a lot of things, but there should be a way to do digital humanities without the technical skills necessarily. This is also some kind of support that we have. So there would be two paths. There is the path where you do the conceptual work and you leave the technical work to someone who is an expert, or you put the work in learning it with all that it all the works.
I guess we might disagree on this a little bit, because I think, my own feeling, and this has come out of my own experience, is you need to be conversant at least a little bit with some level of like coding and other things, because otherwise you kind of don't know what your collaborator, who is the technical expert, is doing, right? Like that's also, so I think collaboration absolutely is key, and like we as humanists have to think differently about models of creating and doing scholarship. But on the other hand, I also think that there isn't, there's no cop-out to understanding basically how a database works. That's actually a complicated thing. And like one of the things I would like to see in humanities training is that we offer classes for students who actually like get their feet wet, because in college they didn't study statistics or whatever. Like you kind of need to know that stuff, right? So. Yeah.
No, I completely agree on that. It's about not making it frightening, but anything that we can acquire. And it also helped to rethink a lot of things in the humanities.
Thank you.
So much.